Okay, hi everyone. Thank you all for joining our second week of ICN seminar sessions. My name is Lua Shimunovic, and I will be the moderator today. Today we welcome artist and writer Alice Bucknell. Before everything, some housekeeping. So feel free to use the little Q&A box beneath the screen to ask any questions during the lecture or after the lecture, and you will be able also to vote on the questions that are asked that you find most interesting and you'd like for Alice to answer. And there is also another box which is for chat that's more free form, so you can feel free to use that. Before I introduce our speaker today, a little bit about ICN. We are an international initiative that started this year. There are 5 of us, artists, critics, researchers, along with me. These are Vera, Luca, Michalina, and Clara that you can see. The Identity Crisis Network is a research project connecting artistic practices and discourses that examine, challenge, establish notions of identity and subjectivity. And the way we are examining this is through seminars, conferences, and other exchanges that connect various artists, curators, and thinkers to explore these kinds of new perspectives on the topic of identity. Leading from the seminars, I'm really happy to say that for spring 2025, we are also preparing a live conference in Zagreb. And for this, we will launch an open call that will be open from December to January. And we invite everyone here to interested to apply with the topic to participate as a speaker at this conference. Okay, so today I'm really happy to welcome Alice Bucknell, artist and writer based in Los Angeles with a focus on creating cinematic universes within game worlds, exploring the affective dimensions of video games as interfaces for understanding complex systems, relations, and forms of knowledge. Today's lecture, titled Ways of Worlding, offers an immersive look into Alice's expansive worlding practice, which combines speculative fiction, game engine design, and non-human narratives to envision worlds that move beyond the false binaries of utopia, dystopia, self, and world. So I leave the floor to Alice for the lecture, and after that we will have a discussion. So thank you, Alice, for being here and everyone for participating.
Amazing. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's so great to be here. I'm really excited to talk today. I'm excited for the conversation as well that's going to follow. Cool. So let's dive in. The first chapter on this tour is titled What Worlds? So how do you describe a world? It's a tricky question. I don't think that there's an obvious or immediate answer. One of the definitions that I quite like is from a fellow artist, Ian Chang, a simulation artist based in New York, who produced works such as Emissaries, Bob or Bag of Beliefs, and I guess most recently Life After Bob, a sort of real-time choose your own adventure story that's set inside a game engine. And Ian wrote this really beautiful text, Emissaries Guide to Worlding, I would say maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. And in it, it's sort of this crash course into understanding how to world, like the mechanics of worlding, various approaches and tactics you can take. It's a very comprehensive look into it. It's also a very applied look into it. So Ian kind of bypasses some of the more theoretical elements of worlding that comes out of like post-colonial theory or affect theory and moves into the kind of really like nuts and bolts of like how you world. So for Ian, how he likes to describe worlding is the art of creating an infinite game by choosing a present, storytelling its past, simulating its futures, and nurturing its changes. And one of the topics that Ian talks about quite a bit in Emissaries Guide to Worlding is the final stage of worlding, which is leaving the world behind. And it's the hardest stage of worlding. And this is a topic that we'll be chatting about quite a bit tonight, this idea of like the end of the world or the ends of multiple worlds. And Ian kind of frames it as, yeah, the most difficult element of like making a world is sort of understanding that it has its own agency and it's going to evolve and change in ways probably beyond your control and understanding. And that's okay. The important thing is being a sort of emissary to that world, like a guide for it, a guide to it, nurturing the ways it might develop autonomously. So I like to think of worlding as an open-ended system and something that the agency is distributed. It's not just like a single author. This is something that we'll also be talking about quite a bit. But I do think this is like a very beautiful four-way pronged kind of definition of past, futures, and real-time movements of worlds. Okay, so jumping more into the theory side, this is another definition of worlding that I quite like, which comes out of the new materialist philosophy. And here they describe worlding as a verb, so it's an action, an active word. For Helen Palmer and Vicky Hunter, it's a particular blending of material and the semiotic that removes boundaries between subject and environment, or perhaps between persona and topos. So for me, this is a really beautiful take on worlding where you really understand the sort of non-hierarchy element of it, the sort of the singular platform, I think, that all components of the world sort of exist on. It's like the cross section is the world, if that makes sense. In this world, in this framing of worlding, the boundary between the sort of agent and the landscape is dissolving or perhaps inverting in terms of agency or control. So it's a situation where the subject kind of collapses into the landscape or collapses into the world, and everything is really sticky and kind of moving simultaneously. So that brings me to this topic that I think is quite important. Well, I would say for two reasons. The first is in the context of contemporary art, where we often will hear this topic of world building. And the second is a very applied one, which is when you get to like the kind of origins of the term worlding as an alternative phrasing actually comes out of post-colonial theory. So worlding is a term that is very much tied to the power, the mechanics of power of empire, the ways in which language and cartography are used by colonizing states, countries, individuals, agents to basically stamp out and eradicate, erase, quite literally by superimposing a new map or a new language on top of a world that has come many times before. So I think in the realm of indigenous futurism and also like anti-colonial practice, it's really important to understand the role of worlding, the kind of darker side, I think, of it, the ways in which worlding is really an attempt to sort of, yeah, superimpose or laminate a new world order on top of other worlds that came before it. And it's not a new idea, but you know, the concept of for indigenous people, for subjects of colonization, the end of the world has already come. The end of the world that maybe like white Western imperialism is currently facing or seeing frequently, you know, with the invasions and attempts to eradicate the state of Palestine and Ukraine that we're seeing currently in the news. Like this is an end of a world that has happened many times before. So I think it's really important to understand the sort of political valence of worlding, the history of the terminology that we use when we talk about making worlds. Like no world comes from nowhere. Like worlds don't just spring up overnight. And the tactic of worlding can actually have a very violent and yeah, a very loaded kind of mechanic for how it's utilized. It's not always about creating a better world. It can often be about a kind of erasure. So I think that's really important to kind of consider. So yeah, for anyone who's interested in digging further into this topic, Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak is actually, yeah, the first indication of, or the first use of the term worlding. And that comes exactly in the way that I was saying before, which is the ways in which worlding has been utilized as a sort of colonial technology. So using language and cartography to kind of control whoever can speak the world or whoever can map the world owns the world. Um, and that also goes into another philosopher who I think has a lot to say on this topic, Willem Flusser, whose book Language and Reality kind of talks about that paradigm of how language can be used to basically augur in worlds. Like language is the sort of mechanic or the scaffolding through which the world kind of exists. So yeah, thinking about the difference between worlding and world building. I know I've been very critical of the mechanic of worlding up until now, but I would also say that to take a page from Donna Haraway, Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, who all kind of would whose work could be described as a kind of worlding. The upside to it, to the tactic of worlding, is that it is a very distributed kind of agency. Remember, in the sense of Helen Palmer and Vicky Hunter, the idea that a world is an open-ended system, that it can always evolve and change, that the only lasting truth of these worlds, to quote Octavia Butler, is change. World building, on the other hand, is, in my opinion, and the way that I've seen it used, like historically and in sci-fi and Hollywood, it's like the creation of like a static world inside of which you tell a story. But worlding is more about a sort of active co-creation. So maybe like the idea of authorship, of individual ownership of that world being static and closed. That's not how worlding works. It's always this open system that will kind of move in weird, strange, unpredictable ways, that is fundamentally a kind of trickster. And that's sort of part of the joy and beauty and pleasure of worlding. So yeah, I think, it is a double-edged sword for sure. And I think a knowledge of the ways the technology of worlding is used and abused historically and in the present can kind of better equip us to world together in the future. So that kind of brings on to this question of who worlds. And here I'd like to just have a quick discussion of various speculative fiction writers and types of speculative fiction as well. A kind of classic would be this evolution of what's termed climate fiction or cli-fi in the last decade or so, I would say. A paradigmatic example of that being Jeff Vandermeer's The Southern Reach trilogy, the first book of which became a film in 2014. And I would say that going back to the upsides of worlding, the positive notes, this idea of a distributed agency where perhaps the human is no longer the main character, a world that has its own sort of intelligence system that maybe operates above and beyond the thresholds of human comprehension. The Southern Reach trilogy is really case in point for this idea of worlding as this sort of distributed intelligence with its kind of autonomous creation. It can kind of continue worlding with or without humans in the picture. So I'm just going to do a quick drive-by through some of my work to sort of explain a little bit of how I like the world. So Swamp City is a project that definitely took a page from Annihilation and climate fiction and the Southern Reach trilogy. Also a page from growing up in Florida, pretty close to the Everglades, and kind of trying to understand a little better how disaster tourism plays a role in like future swamps and kind of like future Floridian imaginaries. So yeah, Swamp City was a film that was looking at this like speculative eco-tourist park set in the Florida Everglades. There was kind of three main protagonists, an architect behind the design and development of the park, an alligator who was kind of questioning the architect's every move, and finally a tree, a resurrected bald cypress tree based on a real life tree, the oldest and largest bald cypress tree on the North American continent that was actually burned down by somebody in the park accidentally in 2013. And in this story of Swamp City, this tree, which is known as the Senator, who was known as the Senator, is brought back to life using some kind of AI contraption. And it basically becomes the sort of neural intelligence system of the park. Like, so it's sort of responsible for monitoring the park's like carbon footprint, airflow, air quality, satisfaction of the guests, etc. But yeah, I mean, as typical of my work, I think like one thing that I took a lot from various worlding theorists is this idea that no story is like a monologue is never, nothing good ever came out of a monologue, I guess you could say. So the idea of kind of splitting the narrative, of having this sort of polyphonic or polyvocal attempt at scaffolding a world that comes from all these different perspectives, that is sort of hallucinogenic. Like it's the narrative structure of the story is cyclical, so you can kind of come in and watch the video at any point. The way that these characters are sort of pushing on each other, but also melding into each other, it's a very sort of kaleidoscopic way of making a world and telling a story, but I really do believe in that sort of um, mixed and multiple author kind of or multiple narrator, let's say, approach to worlding. So yeah, I mean, as typical of my work, it's often bringing in real world incidents or events like the accidental burning down of the senator, the old bald cypress tree in the Everglades, with kind of solar punk, ecotourism, various architectural icons of the Sunshine State, including the fabulous Florida Seminole Hard Rock Hotel and Casino that is shaped like a gigantic electric guitar, based outside Miami, as well as the sort of seasteading movement. And finally, the half Earth theory, which is a proposal by the late biologist Edward O. Wilson to basically split the Earth in two. It's a very Noah's Ark kind of vibe. Shockingly, it got a lot of airtime and attention when it came out, I think around a decade ago now. The idea, yeah, was basically to kind of rewild, literally just cut the Earth in half, but like rewild half of it, or like move all of the quote unquote nature to one side, and then basically turn the other side into like a mega city for humans. And yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting, like for me, this sounds like a fundamentally screwed up proposal that is really like a red flag or sign of the times. But I mean, it's filled with so many questions, like who's yeah, like whose countries are going to become a new age kind of Garden of Eden, whose aren't, where like how does the movement of peoples work? I mean, yeah, there's just kind of like there's a lot of really crazy ideological leaps that happen here, but yeah, nonetheless it caught on. Also, I mean, yeah, I mean, barring the geopolitics of it all, just the kind of question around like, is this just another attempt at engineering the world, like engineering a climate system, engineering a new nature, this kind of dogged belief that humans can kind of divvy up and parcel out the natural world and its functions in whichever way they see fit, or whichever way is the most efficient. And finally, this kind of salvationist complex, I think, of humanity, to kind of yeah, geoengineer at this scale is shocking to me and worthy of a lot of criticism. But seemingly this this proposal was quite well received. So anyways, moving on. What I'm gonna do in order to save time is to actually not show any film. Like I do have still slides of excerpts, but I think I'd rather conserve the time that we have together to discussion. So what I will do after I finish talking is just drop some links in the chat, which will be links to kind of watch these works in full. And I definitely welcome you to pick them up and engage with them later. And if you have any questions or want to continue discussing them with me, feel free to reach out to me through email or social media or whatever. But yeah, I think it's good to just kind of power through, speed walk, I guess, through the work, so that we have more time for discussion. Okay, cool. So moving on to another project, the Martian Word for Worlds. This was a project I made in 2022, so a couple years ago now. It's set on Mars. It's a 3-channel video work. It's sort of almost like one world per channel, if you can imagine that. And in a sense, even though I wasn't making video games yet in 2022, one of the core components of video games, which is this concept of player agency versus like a viewer. When you're a viewer, it's like a more passive kind of position that you're taking. I do think that multi-channel work does encourage, just even though it's not an interactive media proper, multi-channel work does encourage this kind of agency on behalf of the viewer, because it really forces you to decide where you're going to put your attention. You can't look everywhere all at once. And generally speaking, in like multi-channel work, typically the channels are speaking to each other, or maybe one is a primary and the other two are just background, like set dressing. Or yeah, like there's a kind of general consensus reality that's spread between them. But the way that I decided to use the three channel component in this film was really the opposite. It was literally the creation of like three separate futures for Mars. One of which was inspired by the kind of Elon Musk era of Martian terraforming, the sort of planet B or backup planet for the Earth. The other was looking at this really sketchy but real area, legal gray area of resource extraction from other planets, which currently, in terms of space law, which yes is a real job that you can have, you can be a space lawyer, probably advising Elon Musk on like what and what not he can do. But there's a kind of caveat in space law, which is basically even though no country, nation, or individual can own another celestial body, so long as they don't disturb the top surface of that planet, i.e., greenify it or terraform it, you're actually able to extract the resources from it and basically you're able to sell them back to the Earth, like Earth nations. It's like a interplanetary economic system. So yeah, the final level is kind of bypassing both this legal loophole that's sketchy but kind of being implemented currently. Lots of countries have already passed laws like the US, Luxembourg, China, the UAE. The list goes on in order to kind of facilitate this extraction and management and sale of outer space resources. Bypassing that shit show, bypassing the Elon Musk shit show, the third world is Green Mars, which is sort of looking at this planetary intelligence system, like a world that is kind of speaking its own language. The ecosystem itself is sentient and alive and intelligent. And yeah, in this project, I had a lot of fun working with Scottish Gaelic, and which is another story for another time why I picked Scottish Gaelic. But well, actually, let's see if I have it in here. No, oh wait, well, I do, but it's blocked by the talking button. But basically, out of anywhere in the world, the Isle of Skye in Scotland is the most similar to Mars in terms of its mineral composites, like the topsoil on Mars and um, the rock and the soil of the Isle of Skye are actually the most similar. And yeah, I was really intrigued to kind of unpack this relationship between Mars and Scotland further and basically use that as an inspiration to create this sort of artificial language system that was merging all kinds of things, including the sound of wind recorded on Mars by rovers, to create this language that kind of slips between legibility and illegibility. So kind of going back to Jeff Vandermeer's take on worlding as this thing that dislocates the human, using the technology of language, which humans love to think that they are the only ones who have a language on this world or other worlds, but actually, of course, many other species do have a language as well. Kind of using this language against humans, so creating a language that is a conlang or a constructed language, but basically like a language that sometimes can be understood by humans. Like you get a little cross section in the video where something is speaking in this conlang, and you might understand a word or two, but primarily it's a language that goes far beyond human understanding. Brings me to the final section, which is talking a bit more about gaming. And this is kind of understanding what I was saying earlier as like the game as this sort of interactive ecosystem or living environment, like where a world is something that's always kind of ongoing. I think gaming has a really beautiful and obvious, to me at least, applicability of that, in the sense that a game is a world that requires participation from the audience. So this idea of like the audience being this like passive kind of spectator, which happens often in like films, like you kind of get the way into a filmic world is fundamentally through the POV of the filmmaker. It's like the narrative cuts, the shots, the sequencing, the way they choose to structure that world. In gaming, it's kind of up to you. as the player, like how you like to move through it. And there's certain types of games that cater really well to that, and there are certain types of games that don't. And surprise, surprise, a lot of the kind of queer theory and ecological theory work that's being done in gaming is games that really rejects a lot of the sort of capital G gamer approaches to the industry. So games that embrace difficulty, games that embrace nonlinear narratives, games that embrace a lack of action or a lack of combat, even games that are like walking simulators or games that are text-based, games that reject the sort of visual like serotonin boost and overloading that a lot of yeah, the game industry traffics in, is these like kind of super immersive 8K definition worlds. I think like, you know, like a lot of queer theorists and queer game designers have found a very fitting home inside of mechanics and aesthetics that sort of reject many of these ideas around like who gaming is for and what kind of demands it needs to satisfy. So an idea that I really love, which I encountered pretty early on, a while ago now, is this idea of permalife. And permalife in gaming is sort of a counter narrative or argument against this concept of permadeath, which in gaming, permadeath is this concept of like hardcore gaming or macho gaming. It's very gender coded. And it's this idea where if you lose in the game, you lose everything. So there's no save option. There's no going back to like a checkpoint that you cleared. And that kind of high stakes gaming can have an interesting sort of ecological angle to it if it's applied correctly. But it does also have this very gendered stereotype of like very masky kind of like bro-y energy around like hardcore mode. So the game theorist Bo Ruberg, game scholar, has written this really beautiful text called Permalife, and in that coined a new term, permalife, which is moving against permadeath games. Permalife games are games in which it's impossible for players to die. So this is a radically different approach to understanding mortality in gaming, but it's also a radically different approach to understanding what about gaming is so hard, what about gaming is so heartbreaking. Maybe it's not the loss of a world or the loss of a sense of self, but actually maybe it's this question of persistence. Like maybe like kind of continuing onward in this world against like all of the many ways in which it's stacked against you and is basically attempting to eradicate you. Maybe persistence is actually the hardest thing. Maybe giving up and giving in to death is like easy by comparison. So I think it's a really beautiful argument, and a game that Bo talked about a lot in their essay is this, I think it's 2013, Queers in Love at the End of the World, which is a text-based game by Anna Entropy. And Entropy, the mechanic of Entropy's game is quite simple. It's basically a game that you just can never win. You have 10 seconds essentially until the world is wiped out, and you have a set of options that you can kind of take, but ultimately like there's no way to win the game, but in order to kind of experience it, you have to kind of die 1,000 times over. So it sounds a bit paradoxical because if death is the main mechanic, then surely it can't be a perma-life game. But the way that Bo kind of works through this game in their text is a really beautiful kind of paradoxical handling of life and death, and maybe understanding the two things as not being binary, but part of like a bigger system. Like maybe like the death of like you as an individual player is not the same as the death of the world. So I think that's a really beautiful concept in gaming that's gotten a lot of traction in like the queer games community. Second to that is bad game feeling. So why must games always be fun? Why must games always be satisfying? This is a very kind of queer mode of inquiry that's, hearkening to like Jack Halberstam and company. But it's this notion of games that are quote unquote no fun, or games in which like you really are playing to lose. Games in which you take a kind of perverse pleasure in losing. So games that maybe are designed to be won, but you as a player are like, fuck that. I'm gonna like play this game however I want. Maybe you want to take a walk with your friend while playing Halo. Maybe you want to like pick flowers while you're playing Red Dead Redemption. I don't know. Like maybe you just want to kind of go off on a pilgrimage, like in the middle of like a first person shooter. It's kind of deciding like fuck the mechanics of this world. I get to choose like how I want to spend my time inside of it. So that's one end. The other end is games that are like Anthropy's game, Prism of the End of the World, games that are fundamentally meant to be no fun, like games that are impossible to beat, games where the designer is kind of, winking and nodding at you, like, oh yeah, I know that you like, I know that you like, dying 1,000 times, or like, I know that you like the gameplay to be impossible. So like, I'm gonna basically make a mechanic where this game is like fundamentally, yeah, impossible to win. And it's actually sort of embracing this feeling of annoyance, anger, disappointment, sadness, or hurting, and it's sort of reveling in that feeling, that bad feeling. That's another approach to gaming that I really like. And then moving it away from the sort of affect theory and then moving more into sort of like posthumanist discourse in gaming. A really beautiful text that came out a couple years ago now is by Kara Stone, a game theorist and also game maker. That's another thing that I really love about the game field, is that like so much of the time it's like people who are making games, especially games on the margins, like queer games, indie games, like they're also the ones kind of contributing to the discourse. So it's this really nice sort of feedback loop where it's people who are actually like designing and playing games are also the ones writing about game theory and like the future of gaming and the possibilities of gaming. So yeah, in What Can Play, the Potential of Non-Human Players, it's a really beautiful text by Kara Stone, where they talk about various games that are where you get to play as a non-human character. So one of my favorites, which they talk about in this text, is Flower, which is a game from 2009. And this game is a game where essentially you get to play as the elements of wind. So you're basically running through this field, collecting and stirring up petals, and presumably helping to pollinate and kind of reproduce this ecosystem. But it's also just, a very sort of aesthetic, very sort of calming, cozy game where you get to play as something that's fundamentally disembodied and ephemeral. And the world that you create is purely based on the sort of chaos element of you sort of breezing through this world and stirring up all of these objects and agents in your wake. That's it. Thank you so much.
I guess we won't keep you much longer then. Thank you so much
Yeah, of
for
course.
your contribution and
Yeah, it was a
discussion.
pleasure. Thanks for the questions. They were really good.